I'm Sherry Kling. I'm Director of Process and Faith, which is a program of the Center for Process Studies. And our sister program, the Cobb Institute, is also an organization that you may have heard of. And before I introduce our speaker, I'll just mention a couple of things coming up. We actually have two things coming up with Dr. Bruce Epperly, who is here in our company. We have a process pop-up on April 30th, which is a Wednesday, with Bruce at the same time. And that will be talking about Whitehead and Howard Thurman. And it's drawing from his book on the God of the Growing Edge. And then in May, we'll be offering a course on exploring global mysticism from a process perspective. And that we're still working on getting that page up, but we should be communicating more about that next week. And that's a 4-session course covering 4 really interesting mystics and some that you might not have heard of. So we're excited about that. And let's see. So there's a link there to the pop-up. So if you want to register for that, please do. And with that, if you all would mute those of you that are not Gail. And let me introduce Gail. The Reverend Gail Hanson Brown recently got her THD as a student with Tom Ord at Northwind Seminary, and I served on Gail's doctoral committee, dissertation committee. So I was thrilled to be able to participate in her beautiful work, and then now to bring her here to speak to our PNF audience. So Gail is a teacher, a spiritual director, retreat leader, an open and relational theologian, writer, Episcopal priest, and a mindfulness guide. So she is the author of a new text, Wild Geese Rising, Living Prayer as Moment by Moment Contemplative Action, and she's holding up her author advance copies. That book will be available starting May 1. The Kindle version is available for pre-order now, but the book itself will be available as of May 1st. So I'm sure you'll be interested in that, especially after this evening. And she's published some other essays and writes a monthly reflection called Beholding and Befriending Life. And that she may not get much into the idea of beholding and befriending, but that's a key part of the book. And the book is mostly about prayer and contemplation. And I think we'll try to put together a course or something from that book later in this year. But tonight's topic is just a very, not a huge part of the book, but it's something that really captured my interest. And it was just the presence of two narratives in the Judeo-Christian tradition that are very different. And it's just real interesting to explore these two. So with that, let me turn it over to Gail and let her share what she's come to talk about.
Okay, thank you, Sherry, and thank you all for being on tonight. I am pleased to see so many lovely faces and look forward to some lively discussion after I do a brief presentation. So I'm going to share some slides now, or I'm going to make that attempt. We checked me out a few minutes ago, and I was doing pretty well at this. There it goes. So
looks good.
Let me move a couple of pictures around so I can see my own slides. There we go. So I'm calling this a tale of two narratives. I think it was in chapter 3 of my book that I addressed these two narratives, a chapter that talked about sort of the development of spirituality in Western Christianity. And in the book and here, I am focused more on Western Christianity because that's the tradition I've grown up with. And it is Western Christianity that actually has two narratives. One of these narratives, most other branches of Christianity, like Eastern branches, do not have. And so we wanted to focus on how these stories tell the story of creation and salvation from two very different perspectives in Western Christianity. These two perspectives, one of them I call the fall redemption spirituality or the fall redemption grand narrative. And the other one I call the creation restoration grand narrative. The fall redemption one is the one that we're mostly familiar with. It's the one that I sort of grew up knowing. It is the one that started really, though, not until the fourth century. I was surprised to learn in seminary in the late 80s that there was a whole nother narrative coming from the Hebraic tradition, a narrative that was more about creation and restoration instead of fall and redemption. So this is a story of those two narratives. And I'm going to start with the fall redemption, which starts with around the fourth century becoming really a narrative as such. It's not that nothing of this was ever said before that in Christianity, but it was about the fourth century that this begins to get pulled together as a narrative based around Augustine's doctrine of original sin. And so the narrative depends very much on this whole background of original sin. And just to remind us all of what we're talking about, I'm going to read the very stuffy words that are often written, a little bit paraphrased, but according to Augustine's doctrine, all humankind inherits the stain of guilt that adheres to the first sin mentioned in the Bible, the sin of Adam. Humans are born only with the capacity to sin. That was what was in Augustine's doctrine. Augustine thought they're still free to choose among the alternatives for sinning, but they're not anything able to choose anything other than sin. And Augustine makes a point in some of his writings that before the fall, people could choose to sin or not to sin. After the fall, we were doomed only to sin. So that's kind of a rather gray thought about what it means to be human in the world. And over time, as we all know, original sin has been kind of modified here and there to take away that whole idea of it being you're not able to choose, but that the tendency is to not choose. And I think we've all seen many variations of explanations of it in that way. But the original thing where this story begins to really take form as a narrative really is this idea that we absolutely cannot help the fact that we have this stain. And so the narrative is built on starting with the story that we usually call the story of Adam and Eve. And it starts in that story with a reading of that story that would have been very foreign to the Hebrew tradition in which it was really written. In fact, Jews do not believe in original sin, and the Eastern Orthodox Church does not believe in original sin. And it becomes a very, very sort of specific doctrine that takes over Western Christianity. And it took over the story of Adam and Eve and told it in the way I'm going to tell it now, because what I want to do is sort of tell each of these stories with the idea of where they come from and what has happened with it, so that we can talk about the differences. So in the story that is a fall redemption narrative, we start with the garden. And the little icon there, little thumbnail, is sort of that beautiful, sort of fantastic idea of what a little perfect garden looks like, with the bright colors and everything's just in the right place. If you notice, it's all nice. It doesn't have any weeds like my garden has. It's just an incredibly beautiful place to be. And in this telling of the story, in the background, we have the whole Greco-Roman cultural idea, philosophical idea that came from Plato And it's probably no happenstance that it was around the 3rd century that Neoplatonism begins to sort of take ground in Roman and Greek culture. And so the idea in this beautiful, perfect garden is that the absolutely perfect transcendent God, the ideal divinity that's expressed by Plato, and then kind of comes down to us in classical theistic theology, the perfect being God who is totally transcendent creates single-handedly this perfect place, paradise. And into paradise, the perfect God places the human being, the human creature, because it would be a whole nother story, but a little side story is that the Adamah of the story in Hebrew thought it's a Hebrew word and it really means human creature. They don't start to talk about a female and male creature till later when Adam conveniently loses a rib. And at that point, Adamah becomes Ish for the male and Isha for the female. But that's a Hebrew story. We just get the guy's side in the fall redemption narrative. And so even though Eve is the one that is as much to fault as the serpent in this story, Adam takes the blame. It's his fault. He should have had more control over Eve and over the serpent. So in the fall story, this perfect paradise of creation, all the human creatures have to do, they can do anything they want, but all they have to do is not eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or if they do, they will die. And so what's the first thing they go out and do when they have the ability to do much of anything at all? Yes, sirree, they go eat of that fruit. Yeah, the serpent tempts them. Yeah, Eve tempts Adam, but Adam eats of that fruit. And then the human creature has more knowledge than he knows what to do with. Because when it comes to good and evil, only God has the perfect idea of what is good and the perfect idea of what is evil in this story, in the fall redemption narrative. So this is a big mistake. And as soon as Adam and Eve make it, everything just falls apart. The snake, the serpent is slithering on its belly. Adam is blaming Eve. Eve is blaming the serpent. And Adam and Eve are both hiding from God. They know to have shame about themselves and shame about their body. See, more knowledge and they know what to do with. And they hide from God, and God confronts them. And so the judgment is that not only was this just Adam being rebellious and disobedient, but Adam as an icon for the entire human race in the fall redemption narrative has created a situation where all humankind and even all creation fallen. And there's nothing that any human creature can do about it. And so as it moves from creation to fall to judgment, the judgment of God is that they can't remain in paradise. The gate is closed, the door is barred, the guard is put up, and they are condemned, and all humankind is condemned to live in the realm of earth, a realm that suspiciously looks a lot like Earth as described in Aristotle's universe. More of the Greek influence that's not present in the Hebrew telling of the story. But Aristotle saw the sphere of Earth in the universe as the sphere of total corruption. Things decayed, they died. Everything was always changing in ways that no human could keep up with. And the only way to have any peace at all in that kind of an earth was to escape it. And so the judgment that has condemned humankind with this horrible original stain of sin, which they cannot get rid of, is going to keep them trapped in corruption and not able to enter the paradise to which the gates have been closed. Except for one way. God could become human and satisfy the debt that humanity owes to justice by paying the debt that humankind should pay. And so from creation and fall and judgment, redemption in that narrative becomes a way of either satisfying the justice that needs to be satisfied, or it becomes a way of paying the debt that needs to be paid, or it becomes a way of substitution for humans so that they may have the access to paradise again. But it can only be paid by God becoming human and dying on a cross. And not a lot at that point in this story is said about the resurrection. It typically gets us kind of caught up at the cross, kind of like that old hymn, on a hill far away stood an old rugged cross, the emblem of suffering and shame. And I love that old cross where the dearest and best for a world of lost sinners was slain. You've heard it, haven't you? You've heard that story. I remember growing up with that story. And here's the thing. The story doesn't end on the cross. The cross opens the gates to paradise, but then it doesn't seem to really go on immediately to sort of that good news of resurrection either. Jesus dies on a cross and opens the gates to paradise, and then the people that live on earth need to be able to spiritually climb this stairway to heaven or ascend to oneness with God, as it's put sometimes. And, there's nothing wrong with that idea of picturing it that way. But part of the story is it's a very individual salvation. And it depends first on being baptized as a Christian. And then it depends on following the guidance of the church in order to get to heaven. And so there's so many different ways that this story gets told. But in the end, what you have is that the Christian story seems to a lot of people to be about how do individuals get to heaven. That we get to heaven, we need help because we screwed up creation, and we get to heaven because Jesus dies on a cross, and the church provides a way for us to follow the stairway to heaven. Or, if we don't, we could fall down into the torments of hell. This story of fall redemption, it's a story told against the background of a judicial process. It's a process that has divine grace in that God does provide a way. And there is a way for us to climb that stairway to heaven for the grace that God has provided through the death on the cross of Jesus. But it's the background of a very retributive justice. Retribution is what we're after. And as we know, any of us that work with justice issues in our communities, there is also a restorative justice that has a whole different framework in which it operates. Rather than looking for retribution, restorative justice looks for restoration. And that leads us to a different way of telling the story, because this fall redemption narrative is just one way of telling the story. The other way of telling the story, instead of a judicial process, is a relational process. I call it the creation restoration grand narrative. I'm not the only one that's ever come up with that. I borrowed it from some other people. I think that N.T. Wright sometimes calls it that, and Amy Jill Levine sometimes calls it that. But the creation restoration grand narrative emerges from the ancient Hebrew tradition. And it would have been the narrative of creation and salvation that Jesus would have grown up in, that Jesus would have known best. He wouldn't have known anything about original sin because in the 4th century, he wasn't teaching and preaching. Paul also grew up in this, although many of Paul's letters have been reinterpreted after the 4th century, more in the light of that fall redemption narrative than in light of the creation restoration grand narrative in which they probably were first written. So let's turn to this narrative for just a minute. At the center of the fall redemption narrative was original sin. At the center of the creation restoration narrative is original blessing. And here's the thing about the original blessing. The original blessing is the blessing of a relational and ongoing creative process. It's not some perfect state of being. It's definitely not something that never changes. It is an ongoing creative process involving God and creation in bringing new life to be. That is the original blessing that the creation and restoration narrative centers around. Now we know the words that begin the story of the cosmic story of creation. These are the words that that introduce that story. First things we read when we open the Bible to Genesis. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. I want you to notice especially those last couple of verses about the darkness and the wind. Because as the story continues, and as God with creation brings new life into becoming, God starts by speaking into the darkness and speaking into the wind. And it sets a pattern. It sets a pattern for the whole creative process that is a process of blessing, a process of God calling into creation to let life be, and creation responding to God's call by allowing life to be. And each time it is a blessing and it is good. And so it begins with God speaking into the darkness and calling for the darkness to let there be light. And the darkness lets there be light. And it is a blessing. And it is good. And God calls to the wind over the waters to separate the waters below from the waters above. And the wind and the waters respond to the call. And it is good. It's a blessing. You hear that call and response? It's a poem. It's a liturgical poem of call and response that says, in the beginning, God's intention is with creation, not out on some outer Aristotelian sphere, being an unmoved mover, but with creation and with all creation continuing to evolve an ongoing life. And so the pattern does continue. And God speaks to creation to call forth land and vegetation. And God speaks to creation to call forth sun and moon and stars. And God speaks to creation to call forth fish or swimming creatures in the water and birds in the air. And God calls to creation to create, to bring forth animals, land creatures. And then, still on the sixth day, God calls upon God's self and all of the things that make God so much who God is. God calls upon God's self to create human creatures, male and female, in God's image. And because these human creatures, because we are created in God's image, we are created with the most extensive freedom and the most exquisite responsibility of any creature at all. Freedom, but freedom with responsibility. And so all in this story, all of the creatures have some kind of vocation, something that because of who they are adds to the life and the magnificent diversity of life among this incredibly interconnected creation that God and creation are making together. And to the human creatures, their particular vocation has to do with how they use their freedom and responsibility. They are to use their responsibility to let be, and let be has a dual meaning. It means both everything that happened in the first 6 days of calling life to be and letting life be, and all the action of that put into the creative process. I don't know how many of you create something. You all do, whether you realize it or not, because even if the only thing you're creating is the life you live, it takes a lot of action. And so in this whole process, there is a seventh day, a day that's intended to be a day of letting be, to let all creation be what it is. A rabbi told me once that in Jewish thought, they don't mow the grass on Saturday, the Sabbath, the seventh day for them, the day to let it be. They don't mow the grass because it's a time to let grass just be grass. So the mentality of the seventh day, whenever it is, it doesn't matter what particular day or what it's done, but the importance of it is the delight in what is just as it is. And then the week starts again with more creativity and productivity. Now that is the story that comes from a Hebrew tradition. And it's a story that presents a vision of God's shalom. That word shalom that we like to translate peace, but we just a little bitty surface of what the word means when we say peace. Because shalom means a wholeness. Shalom means an entire wellness of being for all relations. All relations are created in this oneness of interconnectedness. And shalom speaks to that interconnectedness, that understands that what helps one helps all and what hurts one helps all. And so God's vision of shalom is this whole creative process in which every day we get up and we can say, this is the day God and creation make. This is the day God and creation will make. And all life belongs to the work of that ongoing creation, God's vision of shalom. The movement here goes through the same themes that we saw in the fall and redemption. Familiar themes to most of us who do any work with Christian narrative, themes of creation, sin, judgment, redemption. But just as in the fall redemption narrative, there were particular understandings of what creation meant and what sin meant in terms of a fall and an original sin, and what judgment meant in terms of a punishment, and what redemption meant in terms of somebody paying the price and then you winning the reward, your reward, working out your salvation on an individual basis. Well, in this, creation means the process. Creation means the ongoing process of bringing new possibilities to life, day by day, in all relations, exercising our freedom and responsibility for the increase of shalom, for the increase of well-being, for the increase of flourishing among all relations in the whole earth family. Likewise, sin means the failure to exercise that freedom responsibly. And in the Hebrew understanding of the Adam and Eve story, that's what that whole story is about. In that story, the garden isn't something about a paradise, it's just the setting where the action of what it looks like when humans abdicate their responsibility and exploit their freedom. And it becomes an icon for every other story that is told within really the Old Testament. And because Christians picked up that same mentality on that at first through the New Testament too, that what happens is sin, alienation, rupture, when we exercise freedom without responsibility for what we're called to be, agents of God with creation and the ongoing work of shalom. So judgment looks different too. Instead of judicial, it's relational. It's a truth-telling, like the truth-telling of the Hebrew prophets, or the truth-telling of Jesus. It's a truth-telling of what the rupture has caused, why the rupture has caused it, and what needs to be done to heal and to move forward. Throughout the Hebrew telling of the Old Testament stories, God is always working through a people and through creation to make a space forward where there is no space. But that ability for people to join God in that work of shalom begins with a truth-telling that is judgment. This means that then redemption looks not so much like retributive justice, but like restorative justice. It's not so much who pays the price for the mess we've made, who can we blame for it. Do we want to blame the powers that be? Do we want to blame this? We want to blame that? But restoration begins here on earth. It begins by bringing the shalom of heaven down to earth instead of escaping earth to get to another place where we can find the peace of heaven. So restoration has to do with our engagement in the ongoing work of shalom, which is always something of an evolutionary process. It's not just a straightforward, we do this, we do this, we do this, bang, we got shalom down there. It weaves in and out and in and out and in and out of each other, always moving in the direction with an aim for well-being and flourishing. So two stories, a relational, process-centered story of original blessing, or a judicial process centered on original sin. Original sin has won out for many years because it grew larger and larger to the point where the Hebrew tradition of creation, restoration almost disappeared, but not quite. Elements of it still exist in things like process theology, like open and relational theology, like some aspects of Eastern Orthodoxy, like Celtic spirituality, like Franciscan spirituality, like many of the liberation theologies, and on and on. Elements still exist. It's still there. Following the fall redemption way led us through many philosophies and systems of political power to try to form a Christendom that could get us to the heaven we need to be in. But today we face many, many interlocking crises. And a lot of them were caused by the mentality of a fall redemption narrative in which it really doesn't matter what happens in this world. We just got to get through it to get someplace else. So perhaps it's time to learn how to retell the creation restoration story in a way that brings hope.